Okay, very cool. So give me 1 second to pull over. What happened to my mouse here? I think the kids. Oh, hold on. What is the situation? Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, getting ready to officially start.
Awesome.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Play Big podcast. We are so excited for our next very special guest, the one and only Dan Leffelar, and we cannot wait to jump in and start picking his brain. Okay. Dan is the managing director at Novus Global, which is an executive coaching firm for top business leaders, professional athletes, and artists to go beyond high performance. So they have worked with many organizations and teams from Starbucks, NBC Universal, Red Bull, all the way to professional sports like the NHL and many organizations in between. So Dan, before we jump into all the questions, can you tell us a little bit more about your story, your background, who you are?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And so I come at this world from kind of a unique place. So I was a speed skater. I was an athlete, watched the Olympics in '98, which dates me a little bit. I'm from Canada as well. So saw a bunch of Canadians win a bunch of Olympic medals and got really inspired to pursue sport and found that sport and was actually quite good at it. Was ranked in the top 10 in the country that I skated in. And eventually I actually ended up retiring at the age of 21, which is a bit young. But the reason I stopped skating had nothing to do with the training facility. I was in the best training facility in the world. It had nothing to do with my coach. My coach ended up, he led actually the Canadian team for multiple Olympic Games. Excellent coaching, excellent equipment. I had the best equipment I could have access to. The problem that I had was what was going on in between my ears. The thoughts that I was having, discouragement, frustration, hyper-competitiveness. There was just a number of factors that were getting in my way. And so I ended up stepping away from a sport I deeply loved with a lot of sorrow around it, and proceeded into a world of going to school and kind of bringing all that mindset into academia, and got a degree, and then ended up eventually working at a nonprofit as an executive, and then became kind of by accident, started doing some coaching work in the corporate space, and was doing that work for a couple of years. And then I met a young hockey player, and it's almost like everything aligned. I began to realize the things I was learning and coaching corporate leaders around were the very things that were extremely effective for athletic performance. And then I realized, oh man, I wish I would have had this for me.
Yeah.
And so from that past, it really took the work that we've been doing as a company with Novus Global, both in the corporate and sports space and the artist space. And my focus has been primarily on the athletic space. Specifically, I started with younger hockey players, and then the results began just to kind of speak for themselves. And now I work with many NHL players, as well as some corporate clients and CEOs of companies, fairly large companies. We're talking kind of hundreds of millions of billions of dollar companies. So,
Dan, that whole time, it made me think, that whole time that you were going through those struggles as a speed skater, and which ultimately led to you retiring at 21. Were you? How aware were you of those thoughts, those limiting thoughts and things, and those destructive thoughts, or did that something that you realized later?
That's a really good question. For me, it was, I'd seen a sports psychologist when I was at the Canada Games. It's just like a mini version of the Olympics for Canada. And I'd seen one before and after that, and really struggled to articulate what was going on. And I actually really believe in therapeutic space. I have a therapist, they're great. But for me and what was going on, it wasn't a disruptive enough space for me to really recognize what you're talking about. Like, what were these thoughts that I was having, and what were the beliefs that I had about myself? What were the beliefs I had about people around me? The irony of the whole situation was my last year skating, I kept getting dropped by about 10 meters when we were training, and then out on the, when we're on the fields doing HIIT workouts or fartleks or whatever we're doing, I was noticing, you know, I was keeping up, but then every once in a while I get dropped and left behind, and it was really frustrated by that. And then in hindsight, when I look back, I was being dropped by at that year, number 1 and number 3 in the world. And that was discouraging to me rather than inspiring me. So there was, but nobody had conversations with me about the way I was thinking about it. And so it wasn't until after, like you had indicated, after, when I look back, I go, oh, that's what was going on. I wasn't really, I was victimized in that situation. I wasn't thinking about the opportunity that it was. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of a place of empowerment. And so for me, that's one of the first steps whenever I'm working with an athlete, is to slow down and begin to get the lay of the land. Like, how do they think about their current situation? How do they think about their past? How do they think about their future? And ultimately, what do they want to go create? And that's the thing I'm most interested in. And that's where it's a little bit different than maybe a therapeutic space, which is a little bit more focused on what's happened to you, how has it impacted you up until this point. I want to know where you want to go and what thoughts and beliefs you need to get there in order to achieve it.
Interesting. Right, versus instead of the past, you're more about their future. So when did you make that realization? Because you had already started to work with business clients and things. Was it after meeting that hockey player that all of a sudden it all connected for you with back to your own athletic career and the similarities between mental performance in general with sports and business, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it's interesting. When I started doing the coaching work, and I've had a coach, by the way, it's the first thing we tell everyone: don't hire a coach who doesn't have a coach. So, because it's like a doctor who doesn't go to the doctor. So for me, it was a process of, through my own training and then my own coaching, I knew I was confronting, and all your athletes should probably, I would expect they would know this, that a lot of the lessons you learn in sport are life lessons. They're not sport lessons, right? Yeah. Leadership and discipline and focus, all those things are directly applicable. And there's reasons why guys like Magic Johnson are, successful on the court, and then or the late Kobe Bryant, extremely successful off the court in business. It's because it's the same basic muscle group mentally that I think are needed to become successful in those spaces. So, but for me, I was working in that corporate space, then working on myself and my own coaching, and a lot of those beliefs, a lot of those things that had crept up on me as an athlete were being mined and worked on there. And so there was kind of this is the same sort of conversations I used to have in my mind when I was an athlete. Now I'm not an athlete. I'm doing some of these things in my personal life and in my corporate vocational life. And then when I met, it was a young player who had just come off his rookie season in the WHL in Canada up here. And he's a great guy, good friend. And I met him when he was 15, just turning 16. It was 16. Yeah, it was his 16 year. And he had gotten 2 points in his rookie season, the WHL. And the year before that had been a high touted prospect, had captained one of the national teams, had won a big trophy, like a very successful guy. So he came into this moment of the WHL and underperformed in his own mind. And I met him at the end of that season. And I told him, I was like, hey, I think there's some things that I'm learning even as I'm coaching in this space that I think would dramatically help you. And the next season, I think he got just under 50 points in that second campaign. And then it basically continued. But he led the league this last year, the shortened season. And this was his last season. And he's now the team captain of that team. But to work on some of those mindset pieces, it all kind of, I kind of sensed it would click, but I didn't realize how powerfully it would click until we got into the space.
What do you think the biggest breakthrough for him was then? What was it that shifted his thought process?
Yeah, I think we should ask him that. I can ask him. You guys can interview him if you want.
That'd be great. Yeah.
His name is James Hamlin. So he just signed a deal with he's going to go play in the AHL next season. And if you ask James, I think this is the case for most of the athletes I work with, the NHL all the way down. And I predominantly work primarily with NHL players. We have the coaches in our firm who work with athletes in the WHL, the AHL, junior leagues all the way down. And the biggest thing is probably, I think, the most powerful thing to focus on is how a person relates to failure or perceived failure.
Right.
So how do you relate to when you miss the net, when you have an open net? How do you relate to when you get benched or you get scratched? How do you relate to, because often what happens as a player, when they experience adversity like that, they start telling stories to themselves in their mind around what other people think of them, what they think of themselves, and usually it doesn't serve performance. It usually doesn't help them get better. So we really, with James particularly, really slowing down to go, okay, what are your strategies and what are you specifically doing when something doesn't go the way you want it to? How quickly is your mental rebound control, just like a goaltender's rebound control? How quickly do you contain that moment that could derail you and send you off, into the dark ages in your own mind? And you'd be shocked at every level of athletic performance and corporate performance, how quickly people encounter adversity and then they start going down a different road, but often because it's more comfortable. Even though it's not a very pleasant place, it tends to be just the place we're used to going. So it's interrupting that cycle, and that's kind of the base level. That's the very beginning part of what we work on with athletes. That gets them to noticing their own thinking. The next step up is actually upgrading all of that thinking so they can begin achieving what we call meta performance, which is this idea of continually reinventing yourself. And reinventing the way you think the game or think the thing that you're doing. That's a longer conversation, but yeah, that's kind of the basic building blocks that we build on.
Great. Okay, so in your opinion, Dan, working with top performers, what holds people back from what we like to call playing big? That's like really going for it, pushing outside of your comfort zone. What have you noticed is like what holds people back from really making those decisions?
I love that you call it playing big, because it is that. And really, I think most people listening, and you probably, well, I'm curious, like when you encounter your own thoughts around what holds you back from playing big, I think at the most deepest place or emotional experience is just largely fear.
Yes.
Genuine fear. Now, the fear manifests itself in lots of different ways. It can manifest itself in arrogance. Like you meet people who don't want to try something that they might fail at. They only want to do things they know they can succeed at, which really limits, because they don't want to look a certain way. Mm-hmm. Others become very insecure. They seek, and I know NHL players who do this, they seek affirmation from the people around them. And so they really are guided not by what they want to go create or the vision or the season they want to have. They're more looking to appease the people or get support from the people they think are more important than necessarily what they want. And so I think often there's a tension that's managed between, in people's minds, between going after what they want and then staying comfortable.
Yeah.
So we talk about that. There's two, your brain craves two things, comfort and growth. Mm-hmm. And what keeps us away from growth is comfort. If you're comfortable, you're not afraid of anything because you're doing everything that is known, right? So you're, what's comfortable, you're wearing sweats, you're watching Netflix, everything's predictable, right? The moment you step into growth is the moment you step into risk, or the moment you step into doing something that you might look foolish doing. But I'll tell you right now, that first player, I think it was Michigan State, where the first lacrosse style goal was scored.
Wolverines, I think it was Wolverines.
It was Wolverines. Yeah. I remember seeing that video. Could you imagine, just as a player, and for all the hockey players listening to this, how long it took him to learn that, and how many times he would have failed at doing it? Mm-hmm. A ton, right? And if you look at any player in the league, in the NHL, whether it's Patrick Kane or someone with incredible agility, Ryan O'Reilly, right? These guys, they got that way not because they just started doing it one day and they were good at it. They failed a lot. They were willing to take that risk of looking stupid to improve their skill. And so I think the fear that most of us have is we don't want to experience that learning process, that failure process, which is the learning process. And so we avoid it. And this is the second thing I'll say about that. If you ask any teacher, anyone who teaches kids or is teaching anything, if students learn faster through success or failure, they will tell you failure 100% of the time. Mm-hmm. Because success kind of there's an old saying that yesterday's successes cause tomorrow's problems.
Mm-hmm.
The more successful, and I've seen this in athletes, if they have a lot of success early on in their career, that can actually often inhibit them from higher levels of success because they get comfortable doing what they're doing and they need to upgrade it, which involves risking what they used to do and doing something new, and they're afraid to do that. So often what we need to become and what we cultivate in our athletes is this idea of constantly putting ourselves in positions where you're growing through making mistakes. In fact, making mistakes is the evidence that you're trying something more difficult. And so if you're willing to step into that space continuously, and if a team imagine a team of players that do this all together continuously, and a coaching staff, it creates an incredible environment, and an environment I think that will create winners a lot faster than people who are actually committed to winning, but they want to win in a way that looks good to other people. It's a very different sort of game.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the pieces that we try to focus on and hone in on the youth, is trying to reorient their mind and thinking around learning and what that actually, and progress and what that actually looks like. Because I think in their mind, they have a tendency of thinking like, if I'm naturally talented, then I shouldn't have to work hard. And I think sometimes they get discouraged about failure. So Ben and I, we try to really instill in them you have that fear factor, like you mentioned. Yeah. And everything great happens to the other side, on the other side of that fear factor. But there's this thing of taking the jump, right? So you're in your comfort zone. That's where little to no growth is happening. You got to take this jump, and then what we say you land in what we call the struggle factor. There's no way around it. If you're dreaming big or playing big, you're gonna be bad at it at first. So just realizing like, oh, that actually means I'm doing the right things. I'm going the right way. So that's something that we always want to stress to the kids. But do you have any tips or advice on how kids, or anybody really, could take that first step when they're feeling, they feel the fear, they know they want to lean into it, but they're struggling taking that step?
Yeah. Well, I just want to, yes, I do. And I'll give that in a second. I want to point out, I work with several players who are veteran players in the league, former team captains of NHL teams, Stanley Cup winners. And one thing that I've noticed in the guys who go really far in their careers is they're constantly hungry to find something new to learn. Nice. They're always trying different things, whether it's rehabilitation or it's ways of improving their skills. They're willing to put on lasers on their face and, do really strange things, try anything to continue to get that edge or that ability, and they're willing to look stupid doing it. And so that kind of segues into the tip. One of the things that, for any player out there who's afraid, when they think of doing something and there's fear there, it's like, oh, if I do that, I'm afraid I might look bad. But one of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself on a regular basis is, if I had zero fear, if I could just remove the fear microchip from my head for a second, what would I then go do?
Yeah.
People can visualize that. They can write it out. Well, I would do this, I would do this, I would do this. Doesn't mean they have to do it, but at least then they can see what they would behave like if they had zero fear in themselves. And even holding a space for that conversation can dramatically change the way somebody does something. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is understanding, and this is the deeper part of the work that we do. It takes a lot of time to develop this, but once you get there, it's pretty mind-blowing, is understanding that although you know where you want to go, like most kids who are playing hockey want to make the NHL. They know where they want to go, but there's also things that they're not doing that they know would help them get there, right? Like their diet, or they're not disciplined in their practice of their stick handling, or they're not spending time working on their skating. And trust me, I love watching hockey players skate because I can skate better than most of them.
Yeah, sure.
I can go a lot faster. It's like, you guys don't have weight transfer. You can be so much faster, right? And so what's funny about that is, what's interesting at a deep level, there are reasons why our minds work against us. And often those reasons are hidden. The brain does not do anything unless there's a benefit to it. It's probably the most important thing to understand. So if you're not doing the thing you think you should be doing to get better, your brain has a reason. If there's something it's more committed to, and often that's hidden. Often that's not revealed. And so what we do in our work is often we'll slow down and get really curious about what's going on there. It's like, hey, you're not completing your workouts with full intensity. You're kind of sloughing off at the end. What are you more committed to? It's an interesting conversation. Most people go on, I don't know. They have no clue, right? But you start digging into that, you start to realize, oh, there's forces at work inside your mind. There's conversations happening, and by conversations, that's essentially me just saying thinking. There's thinking that's going on that you're more committed to, that's pulling you off of the thing you say you want. And that happens everywhere. That happens in business, that happens in sport, that happens in relationship. And so one of the things that we do in our conversations with our athletes is slow down and go, okay, you say you want this, but your actions are actually telling me something else. And you're saying you want your actions to change, but your actions are still continuing to do the thing they're doing. So what's going on there? Rather than just kind of white knuckling, let's change it, let's just behavior modify it, get it over here. Actually, there's something else deeper that's going on that's usually unaddressed. And that's usually what's holding an athlete or a performer back.
What are some examples of some of those things? Do you have any, like for example, like someone not finishing a workout, for example, like they're more committed to what, just not feeling pain, or is it like something else, like more deeper, like what kind of things?
You're asking for the gold. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's two concepts that we use. And this content comes from the phenomenological work that we do, which is a very long, complicated word. You don't have to remember that. But basically, one thing we need to understand is that our feelings float on a sea of beliefs. So any emotion you have, there's a belief connected to it that often people aren't aware of. Mm-hmm. And it's the belief that has the power. So when someone is feeling a certain emotion or anger or, outrage or joy or happiness or pleasure, there's a series of beliefs that it's connected to. So that's the first piece of the puzzle that we want to start getting curious about. Now, to get directly to your question, Ben, when someone is breaking a commitment, usually it has to do with one of four primary conversations, conversations going on inside your mind. And so the four really simply are: look good. Mm-hmm. So you want to look good. And so an example of that, have you guys ever been walking and tripped?
I've seen other people do it.
Of course.
You've never done it, Joyce?
Yeah.
I've never done it. I'm very coordinated
that way. Right. So what do you notice when people trip? What is one of the first things they do?
Look around.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about the strangeness of that?
I
never
thought of it. Yeah. But that's a deeper belief system instinct that takes over.
It's an instinctual, when human beings are stressed, and this has to do with basic neuroscience, so we move from our cerebral cortex, top part of our brain, down into our lower functions of our brain, amygdala, those sorts of places, the lizard brain, the old brain. And when we do that, our reflexes, our mental reflexes take over. So when we're committed to looking good, when we're under duress, we'll go to reputation management, not to problem solving. So a person trips, they look around, they're not problem solving. They're trying to reputation manage. And how much does that happen on the ice? Right? I've had goalies I've worked with who like they're concerned about their save looking good, which is fascinating. I have championship winning goaltenders that I work with who we've talked about this, right? He's like, oh, I want that save to look good. It's like fascinating. I wonder what value you're leaving on the table of your ability to make better saves, even if they didn't look good. Like Dominic Hasek's a great example of that. Patrick is, horrible. We were, one of the best goaltenders of his generation, right? And was not pretty to watch. Like, he just made the save, right? So that's the first one, looking good. The second one is like it's feeling good. So we will break our commitments. We will get off the rails when we're committed to looking good. So an example of that, this is why we binge eat. This is why we watch Netflix. This is why we, do any sort of activity that derives short-term pleasure in the moment. And for a lot of guys, that's why they stop in a set. They'll cut one rep off, right? And so because the fundamental question your brain starts asking when it's stressed is, how do I make the pain stop? How do I make the pain stop? How do I make this pain stop? So players will check out of games. People will check out of meetings or relationships, right? How do I make the pain stop immediately? And this is what's interesting about that. And most people know this is pretty intuitive. When you delay pain in the short term, you end up experiencing it in the long term far worse. So if you binge watch, it feels amazing to watch 4 hours of Netflix, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But how do you feel after?
Yeah.
You feel horrible.
Yeah.
You feel like, you start judging yourself. And so what we do in our work is we dig into this question. When are you asking, how do I make the pain stop? And how do we upgrade that to how do I make the pain count? How do I make this pain count? Because you're going to be in pain. It's whether or not you're going to be in pain later or now. The question is the pain worth anything? Is the pain connected to anything meaningful? And so that's, and for example, a lot of people don't exercise. I'm mid-30s, right? They don't exercise because it hurts to go to the gym, doesn't it?
Yes.
But how much will it hurt 10, 15 years down the road when you have arthritis or your muscles don't work or you have back problems because so you're just delaying the pain. That's the whole point. That's number 2. So look good, feel good. The third is be right. That's my personal favorite. People break commitments because they want to be right. More than anything, the human brain wants to be right. It wants to be right about everything. So most of us think that we don't, this is how most of us think our brains work, that we gather information and then we make conclusions. Right? So we gather the information, we make conclusions. That's actually the opposite of how the human brain works. We come to a conclusion and then we go, it's called confirmation bias. We go and we cherry pick the evidence that backs up our rightness. Right? We see that everywhere, whether it's politics or sports. And an athlete, imagine an athlete who comes in with the conclusion that they're not going to have a good game because they don't feel good. First of all, I love asking players this all the time. Hey, have you ever felt bad and then played a great game? The answer is always yes. They've had moments in their career where they felt horrible, they got on the ice and they played lights out, right? And they've also felt great and then played not great. But the point is the brain wants to be right. So if you have a conclusion, my coach doesn't like me, my teammates aren't good, this isn't an opportunity. The moment you have a conclusion like that, your brain's going to go ensure that you're right about it, to the point that it can create a problem that never even existed. For example, like my coach doesn't like me. Well, what if your coach likes you, right? What if that's not true? What if he likes you, but you believe he doesn't like you? When you believe someone doesn't like you, how do you start behaving?
Yeah.
You
like,
avoid that. Yeah. What else? What were we going to say?
Well, like they don't like you. So you think things, you avoid them, or you just think that they're talking bad about you or whatever stories you're telling yourself to confirm that they don't like you. So it's your brain looking for the evidence. Ben and I just did a little presentation on this, the RAS, the reticular activating system, which is that part of your brain that's looking for the evidence, right? So that's why belief systems are so important, because your brain is going to go find the proof to make sure that you're right, So and I love that you understand the neuroscience behind it, because it's not just, it's based in neuroscience. This is how your brain, because our brain isn't wired for accuracy. It's wired for efficiency. It's wired to move quickly. It's not so. And so we tell this whenever we're talking to clients or athletes, and you guys with your athletes probably do the same thing. It's like, you're not seeing the world as it is. You're seeing the world as you are. And so when you're aware of that, it's like, oh, I'm committed to being right. If I'm committed to being right, I might be leaving value on the table. I might be leaving growth on the table. The last one of the 4 that really gets in our way as far as breaking commitments is being in control, an attempt to be in control of a situation. And so it's like when you're driving in your car and you drive up to a light and it's red and you need it to turn green because you're late, and you start talking to the light and you're like, come on, right? Yeah. Yes.
And then the light turns green right when you want it to, and then you kind of throw yourself a party. I did it. I controlled it with my mind, and you sail through, right? And rationally know you don't have control of the light, but emotionally you take credit for it.
Yeah.
And so when we're under stress, we tend to go to attempting to control things that are outside our control. So other people, players, the ref, right? We try to control. And it's funny. This is often why players will look at stats or obsess about stats. A stat is a marker of what has happened. It's not a marker of what is happening or what will happen.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that a lot of players get focused on a stat as though, because it gives them a sense of feeling and control, even though it doesn't give them any sort of control. If they really want to if they want to score more goals, there's something in the moment now they could be doing other than looking at their stats. In fact, when I have a player who's telling me about their stats, I actually often will tell them, oh, you actually don't care about your game.
That's funny.
And they'll be like, what? I'll be like, yeah, because you're living in the games you've played, not the games you're going to play, or the thing you have right now. You're stuck in a different moment in time than the one that is actually most resourceful. So that's a subtle kind of sports example of being in control.
Yeah.
So interesting. What I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying there are like byproducts of perfectionism. I want to get your thoughts on this because there's so many athletes that think that it helps them, it serves them. I always looked at perfectionism like you need to look good, feel good, and get the right results, right? It's kind of exactly what you've been talking about there. So in your opinion, does perfectionism serve us? Does it or does it hinder us?
That's a great question. My answer has changed on that, actually. So I think what people define as perfectionism actually isn't perfectionism. I want players to want to be perfect.
Okay.
I want them to have a definition of what a perfect game looks like, and I want them to go execute that. I want them to have a North Star or a vision thereafter, and that's where it's like, let's get really clear about what perfect looks like for you. The question is not, is perfectionism bad? It's how do you handle being imperfect?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's deep.
Right? Because it's easy. I would say, no, because I've heard this, I'm learning to be an imperfectionist. It's like, no, I want you to be a perfectionist. If you ask, and I do, I work with guys at the highest level of the NHL, and I know things about players in the inside track, about how they obsess around their practices. Guys like Sidney Crosby, they want everything to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you would sit down with Sidney and be like, Sid, you know what you need to do? Lower your standards.
Mm.
Right? He'd be like, no, my standards is what got me here. The question is how do you handle when you don't hit your standard?
Right. Yeah.
Are you hungry or are you discouraged? Does missing your standard create more passion or more discouragement? For me, missing my standards created more discouragement because I didn't know how to relate to that moment well.
Mm.
So I ended up pulling back from the things that I wanted rather than going, oh, this is learning. This is a beautiful moment where I experienced a gap between what I want, where I am, and now I get to be like a scientist to figure out how to begin to close it even more. And that's the one thing that I would say every NHL guy that I work with the exception of maybe two, has in common. And even those other two guys still have this desire. It's just not as accelerated. And in their careers, they're early. They're kind of like, and they're not necessarily. I think they could be guys who could make it to all-star level potential. But that hunger of when I experience a gap, how do I deal with it? Do I step back in discouragement, or do I get more excited because I just learned something that I can improve?
So it's the pursuit of perfectionism and then the fallback and focus of the process. So if you stay result oriented, because of course you're never going to play a perfect game, not even the Sid the Kid doesn't play a perfect game.
Wouldn't
right?
it be amazing if you could?
That'd be, yeah, absolutely. So that's interesting look on that.
So is that the difference? We were debating this. We were watching The Last Dance. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh yeah, I love
so like
so
we were debating, like, is that the difference? Is like a Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. You saw that, and we were talking about that kind of that fierce, like, yeah, LeBron, like go to the gym after losing the championship, Game 7 kind of thing, and just the difference that you see that their teammates couldn't, even though they're playing at this high, like the world's top level, they never quite to that level of mindset.
Yeah, I think one of the, sorry, my camera's moving a bit. I think one of the things that marks that Last Dance is such a fantastic example of various things in sport mentality and mindset. One of the things you notice, and this is something that I do with all of the players that I work with, is Michael Jordan's ability to create narratives in his head that weren't even true.
Yeah.
So he would make things up to motivate himself. And that's what I do with my players. And that's very unique to the player. That's something that you can't just like blanket statement It's like, well, what motivates one player over another is different, and then what narratives are going to help them show up. So all my players have different narratives that they're all working on, that I work on with them, that are unique to them. And that's ultimately, those narratives they can take into. That's one thing out of The Last Dance that's really powerful. One of the things that's really interesting to note is that Michael Jordan used hate to fuel him.
Yeah, as we were talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And could it
Yeah,
be more effective to use love and creation versus hate and anger?
I don't, and this is important, I don't think anger is a negative emotion. Most people would moralize it as a bad emotion. I don't think anger is a bad emotion. And I think it can be very resourceful. I think it's funny. I think hate is one of the most powerful fuel sources you can have. I believe that there's one that's more powerful. I think if you love what you're doing so much, you'll pursue it with just a little bit more edge. And I actually think, as much as Michael Jordan used hate in certain contexts, he also had a love for the game. And that actually comes out at the end of one episode when he starts crying. Do you remember that episode where he goes, if you don't want to play the game this way, you don't have to play the game this way? And he starts crying. There's sorrow there, which is really interesting. Sadness and love are cousins. They're connected. And so I think it's very hard. I don't know Michael. I know some people who know him, but I don't know him well. I don't have access to him. But if you were to sit down and have a conversation with him, there's layers there in him. There's love and hate kind of layered on each other, and he used them in different ways. Most of the players I work with, I would say actually all of them, they've told me when they're angry, they don't play very well.
Yeah.
The anger doesn't help their flow state, doesn't help their presence on the ice. If they're about to start a fight, or great, let a little bit of the rage monster out. It's all good. But intensity and anger are two different things. A lot of my guys are incredibly intense, very, very intense. And it could be mistaken as being angry, but it's just focus. It's intensity and focus. But I think The Last Dance is such a good example of the various ways that players can motivate themselves, how they can actually use. And you're right, Michael Jordan, LeBron, I've heard LeBron talk about his training regimens and his trainer and what he does. And then Kobe, and there's this innate thirst and hunger to be better, to constantly be improving. And you could call them perfectionists. You could call them, dedicated to the quest of perfection. But one of the things you'll notice, when they make a mistake, they ensure they don't make it again. And they do that through learning rather than through self-doubt. Imagine if Michael Jordan misses a shot and then just starts beating himself up. He would never do that. That's not a Michael Jordan-like thing to do. The only other thing I was going to say that I loved about that documentary was, and for a hockey player, I think it's really helpful. And you think about so I have a player who won the Stanley Cup with Alexander Ovechkin in Washington a couple of years ago. And I asked him about Alex and how he played that season. And Michael talked about this in The Last Dance, where he was playing the game. And when Phil Jackson came in, he said, "Hey, you're not going to win any more scoring titles, but you'll win championships." And Michael Jordan started passing the ball. Yeah. And it was because he started passing the ball that the Bulls were able to win 6 championships. And it's moving from that. It's pretty funny because if you've listened to it, or you guys have seen it, he talked about how there's no I in team, but there is an I in win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I loved about Phil Jackson, the coach for the Bulls, he really helped reorient Michael's understanding of what winning championships requires. And it requires a level of playing with each other rather than playing for oneself. And actually you see that so Alexander Ovechkin, when he won his cup, he won that cup in that playoffs because he was playing for and with his team, as opposed to what he's an exceptional player on his own. As an individual, the guy can score goals till the cows come home. But it was interesting to talk to a player on that team, on that roster, who said, yeah, we saw him shift. In the playoffs, he started playing far more selflessly because he wanted to win a championship, not just score goals in a game. And so that was I love that The Last Dance captured that. I think it's in episode 4 or 5 when Michael's game shifts. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, fascinating. I feel like I could go over another 4 hours asking you questions. I know we're a bit over time. We want to be respectful of your time, but thank you so much. That was there's a bunch of little snippets and gold mines there that we can take out. So thanks so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, you're most welcome. I hope it's helpful for your players, and I'm excited to continue talking with you guys and supporting all that you guys do. It sounds like you're doing really, really good work, both on the mental side, but also in general, the hockey side of the sport in California.
Yeah, we appreciate hockey in California.
And for
right?
people that are listening, whether it's parents or athletes and things, where can they find more information about you or what you do or Novus Global?
Yeah, probably the fastest way is just to email me directly. We've over 25 coaches in our organization. A number of them work with athletes of all different sports. So I predominantly focus on hockey. But my email is really simple, and we can put it. Do you guys put up notes with?
Yeah.
Put it in the notes.
So it's just Dan at Novus NOVUS.global. Just Dan at Novus.global. And feel free to email me, and I can set you up with a coach or a conversation if it would be helpful. And if you're a parent listening to this and you're thinking, wait a second, that would be applicable for my business, we also do that. And we do that quite well with lots of different people running companies from big to small, as we have a lot of different coaches who work in different spaces. So, but I want to thank you for having me on your podcast. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Oh, all right. What do I hit?